Hey guys, welcome back. Now, Shakespeare's context seems so far away from us in this day and age that it can be really hard to appreciate exactly what it was like in Renaissance England. So, we have to make sure that we understand and appreciate the basics, otherwise, we'll make a mess of it and generalise things. In this video, we're going to do that by looking at three central aspects of Shakespeare's context: the Renaissance, religion, and social order. If we nail these, then we'll have a really good working idea of what Shakespeare's context was like. It's still going to be a bit hazy, of course, but you don't exactly have time to become an expert. The most important thing to take away, however, from context comes back to the idea of composition, because all the aspects of Shakespeare's world really influenced the way the text was created and the ideas he intended to portray. So let's start really broad and think about what the word Renaissance means. So the word Renaissance refers to a big period in history, from roughly the 14th century to the 17th century. Now, because Western human history is a big thing, we like to divide it up into little things. So in this spirit, what we now call the Renaissance is seen as a period which seeks to escape what is now called the Middle Ages, or the medieval period, which it saw as being a bit dark and backwards, by looking back to the wisdom of the classical period, which was the one with all the Greeks and Romans. The Renaissance started out in Italy and eventually moved throughout Europe. Its main proponents were big on having a population that could read, write, and think with eloquence in order that they could better themselves. So they looked back to the wisdom of the classical ages and began to learn whatever they could get their hands on. Although it arguably started out in Italy as early as the late 13th century with writers like Dante and Petrarch, England was a little late to the party. The Renaissance really only reached England in the 16th century, and surprise, surprise, Shakespeare is a major player in the English Renaissance. Shakespeare wrote his plays between 1589 and 1614 in what we now call the height of the English Renaissance. His work is full of classical allusions and high, challenging human dramas, and this demonstrates his commitments to the ideals of the Renaissance. So, the purpose of his composition was to make people think and learn a little bit. So it's important to think of Shakespeare as being somewhat of a Renaissance pioneer, committed to knowledge and learning and the wisdom of the classical period. He is both influenced by foreign Renaissance writers that come before him, but also helps the progress of the Renaissance along himself by being a major part of the English Renaissance. When writing about Shakespeare in an essay, you can consider what parts of Shakespeare's plays really make him a Renaissance writer. If you think he's challenging views or raising deep questions, then you could argue that he's committed to the Renaissance cause of educating and bettering, but always make sure that you tie points about context to big ideas, like what we talked about in our essay videos. Okay, cool. So now let's move on to religion. In Shakespeare's time, Protestantism was the official religion of the country. During Elizabeth I's reign, long-running disputes between Protestants and Catholics was starting to get ugly, and they became much uglier once James I took the throne. Think gunpowder plot. But they were all still Christians, and early modern England was a very religious, God-fearing place. In fact, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries called Christopher Marlowe, also a famous playwright, actually had a warrant issued for his arrest solely because he had supposedly taken the Lord's name in vain. So, how can we use this information about religion in our analysis of Shakespeare? Well, first of all, bear in mind that it would have been very hard for Shakespeare to explicitly criticise religion in any of his plays, as he would have been literally arrested. If you ever suggest that Shakespeare does in fact critique religion, which might also be true, he must be doing it subtly. Also, it's useful to note that Shakespeare's plays draw on Christian imagery extensively, as biblical allusions were pretty effective for an audience intimately familiar with the Bible. So if you are ever stuck looking for imagery to analyse in a scene, have a little look for some religious allusions, because there is a whole bunch in every play. Pilgrimage, Adam and Eve, the serpent, salvation, heaven and hell, and God are all things to look out for. Learn some of the stories and then ask yourself, how does Shakespeare use these biblical allusions to add meaning? Maybe they emphasise the goodness of one character, or maybe they emphasise the devilish nature of another. Awesome, so let's finally think about social order. So, who held the power? First up, you need to know that the early modern society was run by old white guys who had land. Now, there's three key terms to understand here, and they are patriarchal, feudal, and gerontocratic. So let's go through these terms one by one. First of all, the word patriarchy basically just describes a societal system in which men hold all the power. In a patriarchal society, men and men alone get the last word on all political matters, all moral matters, all economic matters, really just all matters. If you wanted to say as a woman, then you'd have to be the queen. Women were taught and expected to be obedient, demure, polite, and sexless, and only concerned with domestic issues. Keeping children alive and the family healthy was the most important task for a woman. They were the property of their fathers until they were married and became the property of their husbands after that. It would have been unreligious to be anything else. Secondly, you also have to understand that the Renaissance society was feudal. In practice, feudalism meant that the country wasn't really governed by the king or queen, but by individual lords or barons who owned lots of land. These lords and barons could essentially rule their own lands by deciding who could take part in the land and farm on it, dishing out justice themselves and by collecting money as they felt like it, among other things. So society was divided and controlled in sections of land, and the ownership of land was a huge signal of importance. Lastly, the word gerontocratic basically describes a society that is ruled not just by men, but old men. It's a society where the people with the most power are much older than the average person. So, how do we link social structure to our analysis? First of all, you could take a look at the hierarchy within your play. Who is in power? Look out for when Shakespeare himself creates alternate hierarchies with younger people or even women holding the most power, and have a think about what he's trying to say about the dominant hierarchy in his society. And if you're writing about women in Shakespeare, think about these questions. Does your female character represent a specific idea of what a woman should be? Is she the perfect wife or mother? Does she adhere completely to the social ideal of womanhood? Or is she disobedient, single, spurn motherhood, and maybe even uses her sexuality as a weapon? And if so, what might Shakespeare be trying to say with these departures from the ways that females were expected to behave at the time? The ultimate question will probably always be about whether Shakespeare reinforces the ideas of feudalism and womanhood of his time or undermines them. But just make sure that you understand the context he was writing in. If you see a female character being controlled by her husband and then say that Shakespeare shows that women are treated unequally, you're not going to get any ticks because this was the norm of the time. Same thing for saying that he shows the society is feudal. But you can avoid this mistake by understanding the context and saying what Shakespeare's opinion was on the patriarchy and feudalism, not just using his text as a history lesson. And remember, coming back to the whole idea of reception, the focus is on what you interpret the ideas to mean and how Shakespeare's context influences your understanding of his ideas. And that's about everything. Well, actually, it's nowhere near everything. People spend their whole lives trying to study history, but it's everything that we're going to talk about. And hopefully it's enough to give you guys a bit of an understanding of what's going on. Next up, we're going to take a look at how genre and form works in Shakespeare's plays. So I'll see you guys there. Bye!